So our theme this year, the wisdom of Solomon, is an explicit attempt to bring the knowledge of Paul Solomon to many of us who did not know him. You know, there's two kinds of people in the world. Many like to say, you got your righties and your lefties, you got your sleek versus your hair encumbered, you got your Yankees fans versus your wannabe Yankees fans, and you got those who knew Paul and those who didn't know Paul. Well, the previous 3 days, our pre-gathering was an incredible sharing of information, certainly for me, about the value of the seven terraces and inner light consciousness. As a matter of fact, Wednesday, it was a little bit disturbing to realize how much I didn't know, how much knowledge is out there. It's incredible, incredible. So we're going to go at least a little bit into bringing some of that knowledge out this year and bridging it to people who did not know Paul. And there certainly is no better way to begin our understanding and improve our knowledge of Paul Solomon than with Sharon Solomon, the wife of Paul, who has shared inner light consciousness and other teachings of Paul around the world. She has taught in Japan, where she shared Paul's teachings. Sharon currently serves as chairman of the Virginia Beach Fellowship of the Inner Light, chairperson of the Virginia Beach Fellowship of the Inner Light Pastoral Council, and on the board of directors. She also leads several local classes and international outreach Zoom groups focused on Paul's teaching. Please welcome Sharon Solomon.
Sometimes someone will say something that's life-changing, and I had that experience recently at our bi-monthly Inner Light Consciousness Study Group. Brian Berry related an experience he had in a former life in which he saved another person's life at the sacrifice of his own. The reward for the experience, for serving that other person's need, he said, was coming this life to the fellowship of the inner light. Wow. I had never considered that possibility before. I have been a part of the fellowship for 49 years now this October. The fellowship has been at the center of my life since at that time, and I have had many blessings and many challenges since coming here, but I never thought of it as my reward. Thinking of the fellowship in this way, again, has transformed me. It has given me a new level of gratitude. Maybe you can consider thinking about the fellowship in this way in your life. Thank you, Brian, and all of you have been my teachers, my friends, my challengers during these many years. It has been 30 years since Paul Solomon died. It seems like only yesterday. I can feel him so often. I think he comes here often. But that time during Paul's life was a time of magic and miracles, of extraordinary adventure, limitless opportunity, and rapid spiritual growth. Sometimes I have a hard time believing what happened myself, and often I was a witness to some of the amazing happenings. I will begin with the Paul Solomon story, the way it all began. Some of you have heard that story many times. For me, every time I hear it, I gain a new understanding of something I didn't realize before. I hope that happens for you. For those who have not heard these stories before, I think you are in for a treat. Paul Solomon grew up in a very religious home. His father was a Southern Baptist minister. His father's father and all of his uncles were Southern Baptist ministers. What that meant is that he never saw a movie until he was in high school. He never smoked a cigarette, never went to a dance, and never even smelled alcohol. He went to Baptist seminary, got married, had a child, and became a Southern Baptist minister himself. But just as he finished seminary, his wife fell in love with another man, left him, and took their daughter. In those days, there was no such thing as a divorced Southern Baptist minister. So suddenly, everything that had any meaning to him was gone. He got angry. It wasn't that he decided there is no God, but he got mad at him. He got so mad that he bought a pack of cigarettes and smoked them all. It made him very sick. But at least God knew he was mad, he said. Then he drank a beer, and for 5 years continued on a rebellion trip. If there was anything that he didn't do during those 5 years, he said, it was just because he didn't think of it. Then one day, sitting in his apartment, Paul watched his pet hamster in its cage running round and round inside its little wheel, and he saw himself. He was always busy running around and around, getting nowhere, just like the hamster. He recognized he was depressed and knew he had to do something about it. He didn't want to go to his Southern Baptist preacher dad because he knew what he would say. Go to church, pray, read your Bible. He still didn't want to have anything to do with God, but he did need an answer. Paul recalled that years before, while he was in the army, he was a part of a team working with soldiers with psychological problems. He had watched hypnosis work miracles and thought that a good hypnotist could help bring him out of his depression. He found a hypnosis clinic in the Yellow Pages, called them and made an appointment. It sounded great, and he was feeling a lot better until they told him the price. And then his depression got worse. He just couldn't afford it. So he went to his favorite bar, and he told his friend Harry what had happened. I hypnotized someone once, Harry said, and Paul said, let's go. They went to Harry's apartment, and Paul said, I laid down, and Harry started this boring hypnosis routine. Paul said, I remember thinking, lying there, this guy has got to be the worst hypnotist in the world. If anything happens, it will be because he bored me to sleep. Paul must have fallen asleep because the next thing he remembered was doubling up in pain as if something had hit him in the stomach. And Harry was jumping up and down saying, we talked to the spirit and it said things about this other place, these records, this mind, all kinds of spiritual stuff. What do you think is going to happen when you hypnotize a Southern Baptist preacher, Paul said. This was just my subconscious mind. There's nothing spiritual about it. And he threw Harry out. Harry left, but he came back day after day, really excited, and urged Paul to try again. Paul absolutely refused until one day Harry said, that couldn't have come from you. You're not that smart. And he presented him with a tape recorder that he had bought himself. That impressed Paul. So he agreed to try the hypnosis routine one more time. They thought of 3 questions. Paul wanted to know what caused the stomach cramps and how he could get rid of them. They asked who or what the voice was, and they decided to ask a test question that neither Paul nor Harry knew the answer to, but that they could confirm. Finding the test question was really challenging. It isn't easy to come up with a valid test for this kind of information. Paul finally thought of a question. His great-grandfather had been murdered many years before he was born. The family believed he had left an inheritance, but they could never find it. So Paul and Harry asked where the money was. Paul laid down, and Harry started his boring hypnosis routine. Suddenly there was this jolt again. Paul doubled up, straightened out, and the powerful voice said, you attempt to harness powers you do not understand and to contact sources, records, or intelligences you are not familiar with. And how would you try the spirits, should you attain that you seek? Would you recognize him who you do not know and have not been familiar with? How are we supposed to know? How are we supposed to prepare ourselves? Harry nervously asked. The source gave a list of things to do. Learn to pray, to meditate, and to study sacred scriptures. It said, write to the ARE and get the Search for God books. What's the ARE? Harry asked. The Association for Research and Enlightenment, Virginia Beach, Virginia, the Edgar Cayce Foundation. Then the source gave the box number and the zip code. Paul and Harry needed that information because, being good Baptist boys, they'd never heard of Edgar Cayce, but they ordered the Search for God books immediately. The family inheritance, the voice said, could be found in the chimney of Paul's great-grandfather's old house, which had burned down. Sure enough, the money was there, and it was just enough to pay for heart surgery needed by his grandmother. The voice explained what was causing Paul's stomach cramps. It said, your consciousness is disengaging itself from the physical body. When the physical body feels the consciousness leaving, it associates that with death, and it will do anything in its power to hold the consciousness in the body. For that reason, the muscles are cramping. As soon as Paul realizes that it isn't death, the pain will cease. And it did. Paul and Harry began reading the Bible and studying the Search for God books. They started a regimen of diet and exercise, which the voice advised them to do. Several times a day, Harry would lead Paul into a hypnotic state where he would ask questions. The answers were strange and puzzling to them. They still hadn't the foggiest idea of what was happening. They had never heard of channeling or psychic readings. All of their lives they had been told fortune tellers were of the devil. They believed that the last of the prophets died in biblical times. They didn't know about spiritualism or out-of-body experience, and hadn't even considered the possibility of reincarnation. These topics were never mentioned in a Baptist home, and if you asked about them in cemetery, it was grounds for being expelled. Yet this voice spoke of these topics. Suddenly, subjects totally outside of their realm of knowledge had become a part of their experience. The naivety is apparent from the questions they asked in the first few months. They asked, what is your name? Who or what are you? What is it like where you live? The voice explained, this is not a spirit of someone else. It is not even a mind beyond yours. You use only about 10% of your mind. This is the rest of your own mind that you seldom use, a greater consciousness than your conscious mind. To say it simply, it is the God within you. And the voice said, all people know more than they realize at any given moment. When there is a desperate need for more information, they often accidentally tap the greater mind. If the information from the greater mind can come accidentally from this source of consciousness, then it also can come intentionally. There are laws governing how such information is exchanged. They began to call the communications readings and to call the voice the source, which then explained, you have been taught in your culture that information comes through the five senses is the only valid source of information. But it is perfectly natural for any human being to acquire a great deal of information through means other than the five senses. But when that happens, people say of that information, oh, that's just your imagination. And that phrase, just your imagination, has caused all of you to mistrust wisdom that comes from within. You have been taught not to trust your own inner senses. The source said, it isn't necessary that you be religious to communicate with the source of your being. Anyone can go beyond the five senses and listen within. Paul still had concerns about where this information was coming from. Was it from God? Just to be safe, he called his father, the one person in the entire world he knew he could trust as a spiritual advisor. He took tape recordings of the communications he had received to South Carolina, where his dad lived at the time, and he played a tape for him. He said, "What do you think of this, Dad? Is it of God or of the devil?" His father looked him straight in the eye. "It is of God." Paul nearly fainted and took the other side of the argument. "How could you say that?" Paul said. Paul's father said, "For the last 5 years, ever since you left seminary, your mother and I have prayed every day that something would happen to wake you up and bring you back to what you're supposed to do. I knew it would have to be something spectacular. Besides that, there is a scripture that says, 'Which one of you, if your child asks for a piece of bread, would give him a stone? Or if the child asked for fish, would give him a scorpion?' His father said, 'I asked God for something, and I know he didn't give me a stone or a scorpion. That's how I know it is of God.' Paul's father said, 'You go back, get to work, and do what that voice tells you to do. This is your life's work.' So Paul went back to his home in Atlanta, and he and Harry started their daily procedure. Harry would lead Paul through the hypnotic routine, which had become much shorter by that time. Paul would go through a tunnel and into a temple. Then he would go into a trance state and lose consciousness. Day after day, they continued asking questions and receiving answers from the source while in the trance state. They tried to think of intelligent questions. What are the things the world needs to know most, they wondered. They ran out of questions eventually, and then one day they said, "Tell us everything we need to know." But the source said, "It is not meant that we should lead you by the hand. It is by asking questions that you unlock the source of information." So they tried to think of the smartest question they could. One of the questions that they asked, and Paul said, "I'll never forget this one." It was simple. What is God? They thought they would get a whole book, but the source answered in one sentence. A God is a being who can recognize good without evil as a point of reference. Paul began to offer readings to other people, and soon many people started hearing about what was happening, mainly by word of mouth. And people started coming to Paul's house to listen to the tapes of these communications about spiritual growth, prophecy, the mysteries, people being healed, holistic remedies, and many more fascinating topics. Paul would wake up in the morning hearing his voice come out of a tape recorder and go to sleep with the tape recorder still going on and on. This is how the Fellowship of the Inner Light was created. Paul called it the peanut butter story. He was still working as a restaurant manager in Atlanta, and in between going to work and sleeping, he would give readings every day, and thus he spent most of his daylight hours in an unconscious state. He was eager to help each person who came. It was what he cared about, what mattered. When Paul was at work at the restaurant, he was thinking about the people and the readings. He didn't want to be at work. He wanted to be at home, studying, doing more readings, meditating. He was spending more and more time talking metaphysics to the customers and letting the waitresses handle the work. The customers didn't want to listen. First, he gave up his manager's position and cut back his hours to part-time. But the hours weren't enough to support him. Sometimes he didn't show up for work, and when he did, the quality of his work was poor. His heart just wasn't in it. The only thing he wanted to do was give readings and study about the things he was learning from them. But he had to work to earn a living, to earn money. What could he do? There was only one person, again, that Paul trusted as a spiritual mentor, and that was his father. His dad said, "Son, why don't you just quit your job and do exactly what you want to do?" I'd love to do that, but there's no way to making a living doing that. I have to pay the bills. I have to eat. Has it ever occurred to you it's pretty hard to starve in this country? That was way back 50 years ago. Now it's pretty easy to starve in this country. But at that time, even if you tried to starve to death, somebody would get a court order to feed you. It's ridiculous not to do what you believe that you should be doing for that kind of reason. Quit your job and do it. It's God's work. Let it be his problem to feed you. So Paul quit his job. Everyone wondered what he was doing, and some thought he was crazy. Paul said, "It's God's problem. He's got to take care of me." He didn't have any money, so the food ran out. Paul had been living mostly on peanut butter, so that was the last thing in the cupboard, and he didn't even like peanut butter. So even that was disappearing quickly because it seemed that everyone who came to the house was in the habit of rubbing their fingers in the peanut butter jar. When the peanut butter ran out, Paul decided to fast. "I'll just fast until God sends me something to eat. It shouldn't take too long. God has a lot of resources," he thought. After almost a week of fasting, Paul was pretty uncomfortable. There was a friend of his staying at his house because of his interest in the readings. His friend's money had also run out at the same time that Paul's did, but his friend was an astrologer, and when people came to the house and got into conversations about astrology, he would say, "There's a lot I could tell you, let's go to the pancake house." So his astrologer friend was eating regularly. Paul's friend kept asking him, "What are you going to do?" And Paul said, "As I understand it, if you do God's work, he'll feed you." Paul's friend didn't think that was a responsible way of thinking, but Paul continued to believe it, and he kept fasting. Finally, Paul had had enough. "I'm going to eat," he said. "You got some money?" his friend asked, and he jumped to follow him out the door. "No, I'm just going to the pancake house to have a meal," Paul said. "Are you going back to work?" his friend asked. "No, I'm just going to go to the pancake house and have a meal." "Are you going to ask them for a job?" "No, but I'm going to eat." "How are you going to do that?" "I'm going to the pancake house, I'm going to order something, and I'm going to eat it." "How are you going to pay for it?" "I'm not," Paul said, "God is." "You're crazy," his friend said. "Maybe, but I'm also hungry." The pancake house was only a couple of blocks away, and so they were walking down, and Paul was walking in a determined sort of fashion, and his friend said, "You're really going to do this, aren't you?" Paul said later that if his friend hadn't been there with him, he probably would have chickened out and gone back home. But he had stuck his neck out, and he had to finish it. He had no idea what would happen. "You're just going to go in there and eat, and you think God's going to walk in and pick up the check, don't you?" his friend said. "Something like that," Paul said. And as it turned out, God didn't wait until Paul ordered. When he got to the edge of the parking lot by the pancake house, there was a $5 bill, which was enough at that time, waiting for him on the ground. So he picked it up and he went inside, and that was enough to be a nice order of pancakes. And Paul said that was the most important meal of his life. Finding that money was confirmation that he had made the right decision to quit his job. And he never doubted again that God would support him as long as he continued to do God's work. At the same time, The people at Paul's house were having a meeting. They had realized that Paul had been fasting because he had no money to buy food. In the meeting, they decided to form a group. They all chipped in to buy groceries and to pay the rent that was due on the house. Since they were spending so much time there anyway, they decided to make the house a center. So while Paul was having the meal, the Fellowship of the Inner Light was born and became the organization which serves for the preservation and dissemination of the Paul Solomon readings. Yet even with the formation of the Fellowship of the Inner Light, as people continue to hear about Paul's readings, people continue to flock to his house. It was a difficult time for him because many people were desperate who couldn't find help anywhere else. He was surrounded by them, and he couldn't help them all. He asked the source what to do. The source replied, "If a man is hungry and you give him a fish, you feed him once. If you teach him to fish, you have fed him for a lifetime. Teach people to get their own answers. Let the information that you were given, use it to teach other people to find answers within themselves." Paul compiled the teachings he had been given by Source for his own growth and began to present them to the people who came to him for help. Thus, Inner Light Consciousness, a guided experience in spiritual evolution, was born. During his lifetime, Paul spread his wisdom through 22 countries, including England, Belgium, Holland, Germany, Sweden, Japan, Thailand, Israel, Egypt, and Greece, reaching hundreds of thousands of people around the world. The philosophy in the readings has changed lives, lifted burdens, and given new understandings to many who can benefit through exposure to these principles. The readings themselves corroborate this. We would find that what is given through this source of information is universal, that it is available for and useful for people of every nation. These readings have never been for the consciousness of a single individual, but in every time these lips have been allowed to speak, it has been for the benefit of all of mankind. Through the Inner Light Consciousness experience, practical application is given in prayer, meditation, dreams, diet, exercise, relaxation, communication, relationships, mastery of emotions, all emphasizing the ability to attune to the teacher within. Inner Light Consciousness became known for the beautiful meditation technique given by the Source called the 7 Terraces to Higher Consciousness. The Source said, "As often as you come together, let there be a meeting of the hearts at the deepest level, a communication with one another, a projection of the caring, the consciousness, and the love, until barriers between you become broken, and you become able to use, recognize, and feel, to be aware of the thoughts and needs of others. In this way, will sensitivity be developed, and that right quickly, of the thoughts, the feelings, the welfare, the needs of others, and all this done exemplifying God, expressing that all may know the light." I have been asked many times and have wondered, especially since Paul died, how to describe Paul as a teacher, as a man, as a master. As his wife, I see him through the eyes of love. I know I have been suspect because my love for him certainly influences my opinion of him. Then I found this description of Paul that Paul gave of Mahatma Gandhi, and I think it is a perfect description of Paul as well. Mahatma Gandhi, Paul Solomon, was without question a great man. He was a man who lived his life in such a way as to change the course of history. Was Gandhi another incarnation of Christ? The truth is probably this: for a few hours or a few days, on a few occasions in his life, Gandhi was Christ. These hours or days on few occasions were followed by human inadequacy. So he was Christ for a moment, incarnate, alive, changing history. And a moment after, another breath, he was back into his unworthy self and knew it. And he taught it that way to his followers. So may have a number of men and women who have been for a moment that perfection of who they are. And if they are in any given moment, only for 60 seconds, even for one split second, if we taste perfection, we taste who we are, and who we are is Christ. Paul taught that that moment is possible for each of us. Paul's teachings were always practical, relevant for everyday life, and how to live in a supportive lifestyle for ourselves and everyone we knew. No one was a stranger, and it was not unusual for me to come home and find a person Paul had just met sitting in our living room and sharing a meal. He didn't require that people believe as he did, or even as he taught. In every experience of inner light consciousness, he explained, none of this may be true, but it serves me to believe it and live accordingly. Of course, he did believe the truth of his teachings, and did many of his students. He taught that we can live in heaven on earth. It is our choice. The source said, it is necessary that you express the highest that is within you, creating in this world places of light to which men will be drawn for the love that is shared. Then share, have fun, smile, and lift the heart of one another. Lift the burden of one another off one another's back until all the world knows and the story becomes legendary among you that here are a people who have an ability to replace the burden with a smile, so that men call them healers, little lights, candles, new light in the world, little Christs. Then come together and let it be said about you, see how they love one another. Paul taught that we can change the world, that Christ can be born again today, alive, in any one of us. We can experience the new heaven and the new earth, the 1,000 years of peace, as talked of in the Bible. But the way that will come about is by living in a way that spreads joy, love, and peace, getting along with one another, caring and loving one another. Maybe none of us is there yet, but within us is the potential. By choosing love over fear, we can create the new heaven and new earth right here today. The source said, awaken, speak God. Look and All right, look and see that all about you are as sleeping gods, and your purpose is to cry them awake, for the time is at hand. Awaken God in the heart of every man and woman you see, not placing him there, not lighting the light, but rather point to, bring attention to cause consciousness of that light that is innate within each one. Cause them to awaken to themselves and to shake off the dust of the earth, to shake off these physical bodies that are the dust of the earth, and to rejoice, crying out, and to return to the Father. These are all a portion of the same family, and in coming together a portion of the same body. And so together we will rise, that giant body of God, and shaking the dust of the earth from itself, will rise up in glory, in power, in might, in light upon this plane. So then will this plane be shaken, this earth will be changed, transmitted to a plane of light that would be the footstool of God, the new heaven and the new earth. We are blessed to be a part of this fellowship family. Thank you.